We're in the middle of our 1 month break in April, and so today I thought would be a good chance to talk about how do F1 teams compare compared to their expectations on them coming into 2026, kind of before winter testing, before we had a chance to see the teams. Now, we're going to be doing this in reverse Constructors Championship order, and how I want to do this is I want to basically put each of the teams into one of 5 categories. So greatly exceed expectations, match expectations, underperform, and then greatly underperform. And since we're going to be going in reverse championship, Constructors Championship order, it should be pretty easy to figure out who's going to be one of the first teams in greatly underperform, and that is, of course, none other than Aston Martin. I think expectations around Aston Martin coming into 2026 were, I would say, kind of middling. I think, obviously, on one hand, you had this kind of Newey super team, Adrian Newey, Andy Cowell, Fernando Alonso, a lot of money. And so there was hope that, there's, at least on the chassis side, things would be really, really good. And even though they were going to be working with what was a kind of almost brand new engine from scratch with Honda, the hope was that Honda would have, learned their lessons from last time they started an F1 engine project about a decade ago and be much more prepared this time around. Of course, that hasn't happened. I think, obviously, one of the things that's talked about a lot is the vibration issues that they have. And even though it seems like this is a power unit type issue, it could also be a integration of power unit and chassis issue. And so I do think that there is a little bit of responsibility for, on the chassis side is not entirely Honda, but I would say still about 95% Honda. They've been a lot worse than expected. They've been the slowest team in qualifying on a number of occasions. The last couple of Grand Prix, I believe they've been out-qualified by the Cadillacs. So again, not great, especially since Cadillac is a brand new team with zero experience in F1. So definitely greatly underperformed compared to expectations. Even with, I think, some acknowledgement that, they probably weren't going to be a front-running team this year just because of Honda coming in new. I think the expectation was that they would be at least a front-running or at least a midfield team, but that hasn't even happened. They're the worst team. And again, it's close between them and Cadillac, but there's such a massive, rift between those two teams and the rest of the field that, yeah, it's going to be a really, really tough year, and definitely greatly underperformed compared to expectations. In fact, I could probably just do a category all on their own, but I decided to keep this simple and just stick to the 5 categories. Now, moving on to the next team, and that is, of course, Cadillac. So for me, Cadillac goes in match expectations, coming in with a brand new car. We knew that they were going to be developing more of their own parts, not really going the Haas approach of taking as many parts from your works team, in this case Ferrari, and so the expectations were they would be one of the slowest teams. In fact, you could probably say they maybe are slightly above expectations given Aston's struggles, but when you look at some of the absolute pace gaps are about 3 to 4 seconds off the pace. This is kind of in line with what we expected. They haven't really challenged for points. The car, in terms of reliability, has been not amazing, but hasn't been awful either. They've at least started all the races. They had one qualifying session where I think Perez wasn't able to set a time in the sprint qualifying in China. But again, they haven't had some of the disastrous, races in terms of reliability like McLaren had last time out in China. So I would say match expectations, they're pretty slow, and you can maybe justify putting them a little bit in the exceed direction, but I think pretty close to what I thought they were going to be, so match it is. Now, moving on to Williams, and again, Williams is also going into greatly underperform. This was a team that had a massive jump in performance last year in 2025, and with all the hype about they'd gotten things in place for the last 2 or 3 years, such as figuring out their operational systems for how they track parts in their factory. Is something that was talked about 2 years ago. And so 2026, with the expectation that the Mercedes power unit was going to be pretty good. Last time Williams went in with a Mercedes power unit, new engine regulations went very, very well for them, at least relative to their recent results. And so I think expectations were that maybe they wouldn't be a front running team, but they should be at least very, very close to that, or at least again leading the midfield this year. That obviously hasn't happened. There's a lot of different issues on the car. Car's overweight. There's also some chassis issues as well. But luckily, I think with the overweight car, it's something that should be able to be fixable within the season, and so I would expect them to be much closer to the rest of the midfield group by mid-season. But of course, those teams are going to be developing as well, so it's really going to be about making sure your rate of development is better than the teams around you. But for now, definitely greatly underperform for Williams. Now, next, I'm going to go with Audi. I'm going to put them in exceed expectations. So far in 2026, Audi are pretty clearly in the midfield group. They're in that very, very close fight between themselves, Racing Bulls, Haas, Alpine, I would say. I think a little bit weaker in terms of reliability. They've had 2 cars not start races in 3 races, so that's not great. And their starts are also a big issue, and that's really hurting them in terms of their ability to score points. The pure pace of the engine itself, hard to say just because they don't have any customer teams, but it does look pretty good, and the team looks, fairly competitive there or thereabouts with where they were last year. And given that this is the first year using Audi power units, and they can at least say that they're starting from brand scratch, unlike Honda. I think they've generally exceeded expectations. I think if you told everyone before coming into the season that a brand new engine manufacturer that was somewhat competitive, had a somewhat competitive car last year, was going to be massively off the pace and be competing with Cadillac, I think a lot more people would have chosen Audi than Aston Martin, especially in light of the fact that Audi's management has been kind of in disarray and constant flux almost since it got announced that they were going to be joining F1. So I would say exceed expectations for Audi, slightly pleasantly surprised. It'll be interesting to see what they can do as the season goes along, but also into 2027. All right, next up, I'm going to go with Racing Bulls in greatly exceed expectations. Obviously, Racing Bulls using the Red Bull powertrain, Red Bull power unit. And so for Red Bull, again, one of the new engine manufacturers, expectations were, I think, a little bit low. And also on top of that, this is a team that historically has done pretty poorly in the first year of new regulations. I talked about that in my season preview for this team, that historically, because they rely so much on Red Bull parts, the first year of the new regulations where they kind of have to do their own thing doesn't usually go so well. But for this year, the fact that they're so close to the works Red Bull team suggests that, in terms of their chassis to all that, their team's actually in pretty good shape compared to, I think, what many expected. I kind of expected them to be where Williams are. And so the fact that they're, in that midfield group, at times leading the midfield, is very, very impressive with that brand new engine as well. So I'm going to put Racing Bulls in greatly exceed expectations. Now, in terms of underperforming, I think Red Bull definitely deserves to be in that category. Now, of the top 4 teams, of course, being the only one with a new, brand new engine manufacturer and engine partner, I think it was kind of reasonable to expect Red Bull to be the 4th of those engine manufacturers, or 4th of those top 4 teams. But there was such a substantial gap between those top 4 teams and the rest of the field that I think, if they were 4th, but they were, within touching distance of the other 3 front running teams, I think that would be, okay. And that would be kind of seen as matching expectations. But the fact that, especially the last 2 Grand Prix, they haven't even been the best team in the midfield. They've been beaten by Haas's, they've been beaten by Alpines. I think really shows that, I think at least on the chassis side, there's some real issues there. And it feels very reminiscent of large chunks of last year, where they would just have weekends where they would show up and the car would be very, very difficult to drive with very, very little grip. I think Verstappen's obviously dislike for the new rules, new regulations as well probably doesn't help. He's probably not motivated. I don't think he's really been performing at his best either. And given that, as we saw a lot last year and years before that, there's such a massive difference between, their 2 drivers. That, obviously if Verstappen's not really performing at his best, it can very easily make the car look a lot worse than it is. So for Red Bull overall, I'm going to put them in the slightly underperform category. Now, for exceed expectations, I'm going to go with Alpine. For Alpine, it was a bit of a tough one. I could have put them in the match expectations, but I think I decided to be nice and put them in exceed expectations. Now, for Alpine, they were the worst team on the grid last year, using the Renault power unit. Of course, the big talk was that by switching to Mercedes, and with the expectations that Mercedes were expected to be, the class-leading power unit, there were a lot of comparisons made between Alpine in this year and Williams in 2014. And I would say maybe those comparisons were maybe a little bit too strong, especially given that I think Williams were kind of fortunate with some of their aerodynamic concepts that they used back in 2014. But for Alpine, I think they've had a very strong start to the season. After a kind of a wobbly Australia, they've been probably one of the best teams in the midfield last 2 Grand Prix. Pierre Gasly's been doing a really, really strong job. And so I think that it does kind of validate some of the criticisms of the power unit from previous years. That the fact that they're able to put a brand new customer power unit in. They're much better than Williams. Again, they're worse than McLaren, but I don't think anyone would expect them to be, competing with McLaren, especially given the state of the 2 factories, the state of the 2 teams coming into this season from last year. So I think pretty good start for Alpine, and it'll be interesting to see where they can go from here. I think assuming that, their development trajectory is pretty good, I think they have a really good chance of even getting maybe, I think best case scenario, they can get 4th in the Constructors if they can beat out Red Bull. But again, it'll be interesting to see who comes out on top in that kind of front of the midfield battle. Now, next, moving on to Haas. Haas, I think I'm also going to put in exceed expectations, but maybe a little bit more strongly than Alpine. For Haas, I think the expectations coming into the season were that it would be kind of there or thereabouts, similar to where they were last year. But the fact that their race pace has been so strong, Behrman's had a very strong couple of races to start the season, and then even last time out, Ocon had a pretty good race, would have finished 9th without the safety car coming in. And so again, it does show that, consistently across multiple different tracks, very different tracks as well, that Haas are able to score points on a pretty consistent basis. And I think that's maybe a little bit better than what they were doing last year as well. And again, with the expectation that I think the Ferrari power unit was not really going to be on the same level as Mercedes, for example. I think they've done a pretty good job. And so for me, I'm putting them in exceed expectations. Now, moving on to, I guess we're doing both McLaren and Ferrari today. I guess I messed that up. But, so for McLaren and Ferrari, I'm putting both of them in match. I would say for McLaren, I would say that I think coming into this season, we always knew that works power units, the works teams, were going to have a big advantage over customer teams because there's a lot of advantages of being able to design your chassis around the power unit. You have an advantage in terms of just knowledge of working with that power unit, especially with how complicated they are on software energy deployment for 2026. So I kind of expected them to take a pretty big step back compared to last year. So they're kind of about where I expected them to be. If they had not had such a good result in Japan with Piastri, leading much of the race, getting a P2, I might have put them into underperform. But the fact that I think things are starting to look a little bit more promising. And again, their McLaren are already starting to close the deficit to Mercedes in terms of lap time performance. I think I'm going to put them in match for now. If I had done this after the Chinese Grand Prix, I probably would have put them in underperform. But yeah, I would say match for now. Now for Ferrari, again, kind of the opposite. I think if I had done this after the second race of the season, I might have put them in exceed expectations. But the fact that McLaren were, I think, definitely a bit quicker than them in Japan, and the fact that is maybe a bit of a troubling sign for Ferrari. One of the Ferrari's big advantages, of course, is the fact that their starts are considerably better than any of the other front-running teams. So even if the qualifying pace is not fantastic, they're still able to get up 1 or 2 positions from their starting position just because of how good their starts are. I don't think that's an advantage that's going to last the whole season. I do think the other teams will eventually get on hang of this, and that's something that will be an issue for them because as long as the qualifying pace is just not good enough, the race pace again is okay. That I do wonder, where things are going to go for Ferrari. I think coming into this season, we kind of expected them to be a front-running team. There was very quiet in terms of talk about the Ferrari engine. I think you had worst case scenarios, worst case projections about them being absolutely awful. But I think the reality is that for basically the last decade, basically 30 years, even if you want to go back that far, Ferrari has generally been a front-running team with the exception of a couple years like 2020 where they had their engine neutered. So the fact that they're a front-running team, again, not championship, favorites at this point, but they're still, able to get podiums pretty consistently. Does show that they're a pretty good team and they're definitely a front-running team, which kind of matches my expectation for the team coming into this year. Last, that of course leaves Mercedes last, and again maybe a little bit boring, but I'm also going to put them in match for basically just on vibes alone. Basically the entire F1 paddock, the wider sphere, had already kind of decided that Mercedes were going to be class favorites. They were going to be the heavy favorites coming into this regulation cycle, almost entirely due to the fact that they were the best team in the last engine change. And the reality is that those ideas have been pretty much validated so far in 2026. They've taken the first 3 pole positions for the season, the first 3 race wins of the season. They had won first 2 races of the season, and Russell having a bit of an off race, plus McLaren's I think having a pretty strong one in Japan meant that they weren't able to get a 1-2 the third race, but still this has been a very, very strong start to the season for Mercedes, and they have an excellent chance of both the drivers and the constructors championship. I would say probably for constructors, I would say probably 90 to 95% chance to win that. I think you can already see Ferrari and McLaren are starting to take points off each other. So unless one of them gets, solidly in head, or either of them are basically able to completely close the gap to Mercedes over this spring break, I think this is going to be very likely Mercedes' title to lose for both drivers and constructors. And so for me, I'm kind of putting them in match just because I think expectations were very, very high going in. And if you swap their results with, say, Ferrari, I probably would have put them in underperform, even if those results would actually probably be an improvement on what they had last year. I think it would still fall below the expectations that we all had on the team coming into 2026. So there you go. Those are all 11 teams and how I feel they've done so far this year compared to the expectations on them coming into the season. So we have 1 team in greatly exceed, 3 teams in exceed, 4 in match, 1 in underperform, and then 2 teams in greatly underperform. So that's all for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.